So the framework of the nation state had to be set out and set down on paper. The same thing can be said about economics. There's very little in the constitutional documents that deals with the system of economics,
I see.
economic system. But it's also interesting, I think, to note that Adam Smith published his Wealth of Nations, I believe it was 1769. So his ideas about the wealth of nations and economies and economics was assumed to be part of the American experiment, and hence we have competitive economics, etc. It's interesting to consider them because, Jefferson and Washington and Franklin certainly, and several of the others were very experienced with British law and British traditions. I mean, these were people who came from that tradition and were deeply steeped in it. So they were very knowledgeable, and I'm sure, although I haven't come across it in any of my studies of the American experiment, with Adam Smith being specifically mentioned, but that was sort of imported holus bolus. Uh, Economics and legal system were presumed. They weren't changed in the process of creating the nation.
Well, what I find interesting, and I have written about it in my book, The Cybernetic State, is that we're talking about a legal system, we're talking about an economic system, we're talking about a political system, and in the end, it's one and the same system which has all these manifestations. From a legal standpoint, we talk about laws and constitutional guarantees or freedoms and rights. From the economic standpoint, we could talk about the freedom to exchange goods, to do commerce. And from the political, we can talk about how to get elected and all of this. So it's interesting to see how the disciplines have created sciences out of different aspects of the same, let me call this, and I don't want any misinterpretations, the same animal. Okay? I was not so long ago invited to a conference in Yale by Mexican students studying economy. And I would ask some of them, uh, you're studying economics, which is fine, but tell me, what is the organism or the animal that you're studying, whose behavior you're studying? And honestly, they couldn't give me an answer. Okay? None of them said, we're studying the state and everything that has to do with it, the rules, the freedoms, the constraints, the behavior. Nobody talks in economics about the state as being the subject matter of what it is they're studying. They study economics. They have this idea that it's some sort of motor, okay, where society is taking apart by doing things, and it's really frightening to see how the profession, the people involved in economics, don't have this clarity of what it is that they're studying. What would your views be on this?
Well, certainly by the time we got to the early 20th century, the Milton Friedmans, etc., that had that should be well known or well recognized because they talk about the government's control of economics and economies. Uh, but to take a step backwards, first of all, uh, and of course, it's something that is not generally understood. The government system is a system of systems. One of the systems of systems is the legal system. Another one is the economic system. and another one the political system, and another one the educational system. These are systems within systems, and yeah, and people don't understand the way in which there's an interrelation between the two of them. Adam Smith only talked about the right of individuals to participate in free markets and to let that magic or that hand, invisible hand, regulate the marketplace. He never thought about corporations because there were hardly any corporations. He just talked about economic activity being essentially defined as the exchange of goods and services and creation of wealth in terms of a marketplace of who participated in the market.
The original work by Adam Smith did talk about the state, the economy being the state, and he was trying to show how it works, and it was a political economy. That was the beginning, and I think that economics got lost when it started to use the let's say the instruments of Newtonian science, all those mathematical expressions of the curves and the intersection of demand and supply and all of that. It began taking mathematical aspects without realizing that they were really talking about very complex system where all those assumptions of how people behave were very simplistic, to say the least. And it's very worrisome that when economists talk, they do talk about the government, and they talk about the, let's say, the private sector, okay, and that's it. But they miss out on noticing that the government and the state are not the same thing. The government is, as you and I can tell from the viable system model, the government is the manager of the state organization, and it manages the activities of the people, which are the doers, the operators of the system. And this is why I think economists have a hard time. They think of the economy as, let's say, the private sector, and then the government as something that just gets in the way, and it's there to hassle the private sector.
Or to stimulate or dampen the activities of the private sector.
Most of the time they'll say that it gets in the way. But if we are not clear about what the difference is between the state, the government, the people, or the economic system, what it is, then it's going to be, we're going to have a hard time even talking about these things because we are not in the same reading from the same page.
Well,
then you have the lawyer's world where nothing of that comes into into consideration because our libraries are totally separate from the rest of the universities. We have our own language, our own way of speaking, and we should really start worrying a little bit more of the end results of our being so separate from the rest of the system.
I have to confess that it has been rather a while since I last read Wealth of Nations. But as I remember, Smith was talking really about the wealth of individuals. And in essence, his proposition was that the nation's wealth depends on the wealth of its citizens. If its citizens create wealth in their economic relationships with each other, then the total of that increase in wealth from all citizens constitutes the wealth of the nation. Yes, I think that's his fundamental argument. government participation in economics strictly. Uh, Nobody
But
ever thought
I think his views were very systemic, and his book was intended as a guide for people in government to understand what kind of system they were working on. Uh, and it was meant to have governments do a better job by letting people do their thing and let the so called invisible hand work out many of the, let's say, control problems. And it I think the book was obviously a success because it was a very systemic approach.
yes.
He introduces this invisible hand, which we know now is really about talking, he's talking about homeostats, which is systems that evolve together tend to find ways of controlling each other in ways that both can benefit from an environment that's surrounding both of them. So when you let corporations work and let them do many deals and transactions, they will find a way of doing this uh, as efficiently as possible when they have some pressure from the environment to be efficient.